When talking about a company like Argonaut Games, it's always interesting to compare how they started to how they ended. Their early years saw them as trailblazers of sorts, developing titles like Starglider and X before collaborating with Nintendo to make true 3D possible on the SNES, and not long after, introducing an iconic platforming mascot in Croc. They were pioneers at heart, accustomed to leading the way in advancements, but it was that same ambition that would ultimately result in their undoing. Enter Malice, a 3D platformer based within a twisted fairy tale world set to release on the PlayStation. This was to be Argonaut's biggest project yet, combining everything they'd learned from developing the Croc games with all new ideas, namely deeper exploration in the vein of Super Mario 64, as well as a unique style in tandem with graphical fidelity that would have set a new standard for the console. However, it was 1999, and though things had been going swimmingly, platforms like the PlayStation 2 and Xbox loomed on the horizon. To make matters worse, the game was still far from being completed, which led to its then publisher Fox Interactive backing out entirely. On the bright side, platforms like the PlayStation 2 and Xbox loomed on the horizon, meaning Argonaut had the perfect jumping-on point to showcase their technology whilst riding the wave of hype surrounding the next generation of consoles. Making use of their cutting-edge Shadowcaster engine, they managed to strike a deal with Microsoft and got to work at converting their PlayStation game to an Xbox title, with an intricate tech demo capturing the attention of onlookers everywhere. There was just one problem. Argonaut was having trouble reworking the game, which, as impressive as it was, had a whole slew of technical issues thanks to its development being fragmented between designers and coders who worked independently from one another. These weren't simple fixes either. Sure, there were a few camera control and world collision bugs, but one of the biggest problems was that the in-game gravity itself differed from level to level. Malice was a mess, and Microsoft would inevitably back out as well, leaving the project to be picked up by none other than Sierra. With them came a guaranteed multi-platform release, as well as a rather peculiar addition being the rock band No Doubt, with Gwen Stefani herself set to voice the game's main character. And for a while, things seemed promising. The game looked great, with tons of innovative, original ideas, and the aura surrounding it was filled with generally high expectations. But it wouldn't be long before Argonaut would start to run into financial troubles. The early 2000s weren't their best years, and after a period of diminishing returns, they found themselves not only having to sacrifice much of the game's original vision, but downsizing as a company. With little more than a skeleton crew to keep things moving, the project would soon return to square one, as much like Fox Interactive and Microsoft before them, Sierra made the choice of pulling out for good. Left with few options and little time, Argonaut made the tough decision of pressing on with what they had, effectively retooling the game into something similar, but ultimately brand new. And with Mud Duck Productions publishing, Malice would finally release June 2nd of 2004 in North America. However, it wouldn't be without a major loss, as thanks to a great deal of what can only be put into words as misfortune, Argonaut Games would go defunct October 1st of that year, just 2 months after the game's European Xbox release. Now, it's no secret that Malice is a textbook example of development hell, a title sold on big promises that sadly failed to deliver on any of them. I could go on for a ridiculous amount of time discussing what it could have been with its original convoluted storyline and level where Malice turns into a cat, but the fact of the matter is, that game never released. Despite everything it could have been, Malice will go down in the annals of history as the game that, if it wasn't outright responsible, majorly contributed to the fall of Argonaut Games. But is it really that bad? Only one way to find out. Kicking things off with a pre-rendered cutscene, we're introduced to our hero Malice, who, after narrowly avoiding capture at the hands of a few crows, is swiftly killed by the nefarious Dog God. But as is revealed by the Grim Reaper over here, Malice is a goddess, and since deities aren't allowed in the afterlife, she's sent back to the world of the living to sort things out. Meeting the Metal Guardian, she learns that it's her job to stop the Dog God from wreaking further havoc by recovering the 8 stolen logic keys. To do this, she has to journey through a plethora of fantasy-inspired lands whilst whacking and thwacking a collection of oddball enemies. Oh, and there's also platforming. Lots of it. Malice herself is a fiery redhead with attitude, and while not voiced by Gwen Stefani in the final release, it's clear that they were going for a protagonist that can only be described as early 2000s incarnate. The flare jeans, the exposed midriff, that tattoo, this shit is Y2K as hell. She'd actually end up being voiced by Harper Marshall, who'd also voiced Hermione in the Harry Potter games. Aside from being a super hip and cool protagonist, there isn't very much to say about her. It's like they let her design do all the heavy lifting, and sorta shrugged when it came to her actual character, and even then that's dripping with early aughts edge. She looks like she walked straight out of Guitar Hero, and in a game that's all about fantasy lands and whimsical characters, that'd make for an interesting fish-out-of-water dynamic. It's just a shame it's never attempted. You can clobber baddies with a variety of weapons, beginning with a standard club. There's a quick swipe attack that can be spammed for maximum effect, as well as an overhead smash that comes with a long wind-up. The enemies themselves aren't very tough or intelligent, so taking them down is a piece of cake, but after a while, it starts to wear a little thin. It's about as far from rewarding as you can get, devolving into a mindless mashing of buttons that calls for little more than standing in place as rats and crows rush to their doom. Later on in the game, you unlock a hammer, and after that, a tuning fork, both dealing a bit more damage than the last, but remaining the same fundamentally. The platforming's also pretty standard, jumps and double jumps to get the job done, with very few deviations from the expected formula. There are moving and breakable platforms every now and again, but never anything challenging or original. The only real way to shake things up is by getting your hands on spells, all of which affect certain facets of gameplay by buffing Malice's abilities. There are 8 in total, being Glide, Bullet Shield, Speed, Weapon Boost, Health, Damage Shield, Slow, and Nuke. All of them require mana to be used and serve some sort of individual purpose, but that doesn't stop a few from being redundant. Take the regeneration for instance. Yeah, being able to regain lost health is usually pretty handy in a game, but when you're talking about Malice, where no bullshit, every enemy drops health upon defeat, it has no reason to even exist. This game just isn't hard enough to warrant that kind of mechanic, and unless you get really unlucky, it's highly unlikely you'll ever run out of hearts. Provided you somehow do, leads to an interesting take on the idea of getting a game over, as upon dying, Malice is again sent to the underworld. Aside from one small quest, there isn't very much to do here, but taking damage of any sort sees Malice becoming a ghost with 60 seconds to regain physical form. Unfortunately, the full extent of this idea is never realized, partly due to there just not being much in the area, but also because, realistically, you are never going to visit the underworld. I had to go out of my way to die once to get there, and after I'd done what needed doing, had no reason to ever return. It sucks, because this could have been a seriously interesting mechanic. Imagine the finality it could have added in the same vein as losing your souls. I'm sure Argonaut fully intended on doing something bigger with this during development, but if we were to start dealing in what-ifs, we'd be here all day. Honestly, the best thing here is the level settings. They're all pretty memorable for the most part, with talking trees, clockwork puzzles, and even straight-up Rayman 2 cave areas. But it's also within the environments that the game's visual age is shown the most, as making use of fancy schmancy bump mapping, every level looks incredible! Is what you would have been able to say had this game released years earlier. Yeah, by 2004, none of this was impressive, and all it does is make the rest of the graphics look out of place. There's a serious inconsistency with this game's visuals. You've got these areas that are bump mapped to hell, some even having lighting and heat effects which come at a serious cost to their performance, but then there are character models that are either super blocky or have low-res textures, and did I mention that Malice's mouth doesn't move when she talks? In fact, nobody's does. They just bob around like weird little puppets. At least, the ones that are animated do. But we have our goal, and that is finding the 8 logic keys. I've already talked about how the brunt of levels is spent fighting and jumping around, but there are also a lot of puzzles along the way. The clockwork area has the most, with these metal rods that are used to attract and guide robots through dangerous areas, as well as a brief section that plays as a sort of platforming memory game. The most abundant, however, is the uninspired find this item this many times to unlock this thing romp. It gets pretty ridiculous too, not just because it's repeated so many times, but also because one of the levels has you having to find 3 types of them at once. Gold cogs to unlock this thing, red cogs to unlock that, and finally coins so you can leave and never return. Mind you, this is all on top of having to collect the game's secondary MacGuffins, which are heart pots. 5 of these nets you an extra hit point, whilst you scratch your head and wonder, did they just rip off The Legend of Zelda? And you'd better be sure to get them all in one go, cause what I said earlier about leaving and never returning is true. There is no revisiting levels. I mean, technically there is, since the game reuses just about every area, sometimes back to back, but it's never of your own choosing. And whoa, a stealth section where Malice has to break out of jail? Better be really quiet. By which of course I mean run around full speed because the enemies can't hear you. Provided you have the needed patience to get to the end of a level, you're met with a boss fight, and holy hell, would you believe me if I told you it's pretty much Croc 1 all over again? Avoid, attack, avoid. There's no thought needed nor pattern to identify. Why do any of that when you can spam the weapon boost and end things before they have a chance to begin? The only exception to this is the Dog God, not because he's significantly tougher or smarter than the rest of them, in fact I'd say he's the easiest to defeat, but because the battle is such a slog that even with the weapon boost, there's no way to beat him in any reasonable amount of time. It took me about 20 minutes on my first playthrough, and during that process, I was able to reflect on all of my life choices and question if I really want to be the person I am today. You already know the son of a bitch loses, but what you weren't expecting was for everything in this disjointed, unorganized narrative to be resolved in a minute-long cutscene wherein Malice just fixes the world with powers that she didn't have at any other point in the game. And with that, the story concludes. But Malice would also receive a PS2 port. In fact, this version would release first in Europe thanks to the quick converting done by LT Studios. Almost everything I've already said about the Xbox version applies here, save for the visuals. Since the PS2 wasn't as powerful, many of the environmental effects are absent along with the gratuitous bump mapping, leading to less of a clash in style and giving this iteration a slight edge over its counterpart. It's still subject to things like frame drop, sure, but there's more of a cartoony look that adds a much-needed charm to the game's aesthetic. The biggest differences are pretty inconsequential though. A change in the UI style and font used for text, but miraculously Malice's mouth moves when she talks. I mean, it's little more than flapping, but it's better than the absolute lack from before. On the other hand, this port is infinitely buggier, with objects and enemies phasing in and out of existence, as well as really weird diffusion glitches on certain items. Stranger yet, this is the more complete of the two, as exclusive to it are coins that, when collected, unlock bonus levels. But there isn't very much documented about them, so I had to go back and make sure that they weren't on the Xbox, and yeah, the coins just don't exist there. Even if they did, it wouldn't make very much of a difference. These levels are one-dimensional item collecting trials that pit you against a timer. You can pick up clocks to increase the amount left, but why you'd want to do that is a mystery. You'd be better off getting these over with as quick as possible, because, try to stay with me now, they're boring. That's a pretty recurrent issue regardless of the platform. Malice's biggest problem is that it does very little to draw you in, and even when it does, it's just sort of like, okay, I'm a kid now, or oh no, the Metal Guardian's being attacked. It says a lot when Buck Bumble had infinitely higher stakes, and that was about cyborg bugs fighting each other. But is Malice an absolute train wreck? Well, I think that all depends on how fair you want to be. Was it originally conceived with bigger ideas and higher goals in mind? Yes, but it also released as a shell of its former self, and that's just as, if not more important. The fact is, games go through numerous changes during development all the time. Just look at the vast wealth of cut content that exists on the internet. But what could have been has very little bearing on what is. And what Malice is proof that a game doesn't have to be the worst thing ever to leave a lasting negative impact. It just has to be mediocre.